Hello there, Alaskans, wherever you are. Welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show. Coming to you from somewhere in Alaska. This is the place where we talk about, you guessed it, Alaska. Where we keep the mainstream media on their toes and where we are standing up for what's right in a world run by leftists. You can find out more by heading over to mustreadalaska.com and also checking out the Must Read Alaska YouTube channel for some really great content. But first, let's get this party started.
Well, welcome everybody to the Must Read Alaska Show. I'm your host, John Quick, coming to you live from somewhere in Alaska. And I hope everybody's having a fabulous day in Alaska. We want to thank everybody that listens, watches, and reads Must Read Alaska. We do this to spread the conservative side of news all over Alaska. And we really appreciate folks listening in. We also appreciate folks that want to help keep the lights on here at Must Read Alaska. If you're one of those folks, head on over to mustreadalaska.com. On the right-hand side, there's a little donate button. Click on that bad boy, and every $5, $10, $100 donation helps keep the lights on here. We're not funded by some huge grant or nonprofit conglomerate. We're just funded by everyday folks that care about conservative news in Alaska. So if that is already you, thank you so much for helping keep the lights on. And without further ado, we have a very special guest today, Representative Ben Carpenter, who I'm a little biased because he's my rep, and Ben's just an awesome guy. He has put together kind of a comprehensive fiscal plan that we're going to be talking about today, and it's going to be very exciting. If folks watched the governor's press conference, you probably saw Representative Carpenter speak a little bit about it, but today he's going to be speaking about it for a good 20 minutes. So everybody batten down the hatches, put on your seatbelt. You're going to get a lesson on what the fiscal plan looks like or potentially could look like for the state of Alaska. So Ben, welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show.
How are you doing, John? It's good to be with you.
Oh, just living the dream here, you know, one dream at a time. I got my Hope coffee mug, which is very exciting, one of my favorite places. And I'm excited to be chatting with you about this fiscal plan. So Representative Carpenter, talk to me, give us a brief, elevator talk on how did this plan even come about in the first place?
Well, the plan came about as an outgrowth of the 2021 Fiscal Policy Working Group that only came about because we narrowly averted a government shutdown in 2021. Basically,
we had a little delay there. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
We will work through it.
Yeah.
It's early this morning. So anyway, there were a bunch of us that wanted to have a conversation about a long-term fiscal plan. We had to take a tactic to hold up the budget in order to even have the conversation. And that was what happened in 2021, June 30th. We finally reached an agreement, a day before the budget was due, the government was due to shut down, and we agreed that we would have this fiscal policy working group to talk about our options for long-term fiscal plan. Anyway, so we met in July and August of 21, and there was a bipartisan, bicameral, meaning both the House and the Senate, both caucuses from each body sent an equal number of members to participate in this group, and it produced a report that's public, and that provided some recommendations for how to solve both the numbers fiscal problem. Generally speaking, there weren't any bills or resolutions recommended, but just some topic areas. And then also how to solve the political problem that kind of sits on top of the larger numbers problem, if you will. And so House Ways and Means, I pick up the chairmanship of that this session in January. And I decided to take that fiscal policy working group report and kind of use it as framework for providing legislation for the legislature to consider in regards to a fiscal plan. And we came up with kind of a 4-point focus to deal with the PFD problem, deal with a spending limit, deal with new revenue, and deal with a tax reduction in order to spur economic growth. And that's kind of what we're, in a nutshell, what we had worked on and continue to work on. We don't have consensus in the legislature right now as to the components of a fiscal plan. There are people that don't want to have a fiscal plan. The current plan that's in play now some people like. And there are others who want to have a fiscal plan, but lots of very varied opinions on what that actually looks like. Some people want to see cuts to the government, to the budget as part of that plan. Some want to see increased spending as part of that plan. It's a smorgasbord of opinions here that is hard to wrap around. But what I found in talking to folks is that when you say there's a structural problem, I'm not sure that people really fully understand what we mean when we say structural problem. And I kind of wanted to have a conversation today about just kind of an education on, from my perspective, what the structural problem is. And if you would indulge me for a minute, I will share this screen and show you
Nice. I like
a couple
it.
slides.
I heard the word on the street is you have a couple slides for us.
And I just have to figure out how to make the technology work. Okay, I think we're getting there.
Yep, we got it.
Okay, so this isn't my slide. This is Department of Revenue slide. This comes from their presentation in the finance committees. What you're looking at is the spring forecast, Department of Revenue spring forecast for 2023. So this happened March timeframe, March-April timeframe. And this is a pictorial showing the breakdown of money, revenue that comes into the state and where its kind of main categories are. So some people still believe that oil revenue is our main source of revenue for the state. And that is no longer the case.
Wow.
So that's a kind of a paradigm shift that people have to realize that we're not dependent. We are dependent on oil, but it's not our main source of revenue. A little bit of this is skewed because we've had some lingering COVID relief money, so your federal dollars are a little bit skewed. But over the last since I've been in the legislature, 2018, it's roughly been a third of federal revenue, a third of investment earnings, and a third of petroleum. As you can see here for this year's spring forecast, the federal revenue piece is the largest, but it's really comparable to our investment earnings. And our petroleum comes in third as the size of the amount of revenue that's coming into the state. And then all of the other revenue that the state generates is all de minimis, right? It is not very large. It doesn't impact our budget a whole lot. It's $500 million, less than $500 million.
Yeah, so when people say something like, well, just beef up the fisheries or beef up the tourism, beef up the mining, okay, we're going to double it and we're going to move to 0.5 to 1%.
That's exactly it, right? But where does the opportunity exist and where do Alaskans work?
Yeah.
They mostly live and work in that other revenue, other economy. You've got some people that work in the petroleum industry, but they're not the majority of Alaskans. You don't really have a whole lot of people working in the investment earnings piece of this. That's a few Alaskans that work for the Permanent Fund Corporation. We do have quite a bit of people who are dependent on federal money flowing in, but that's not a private sector. It's not like they're generating revenue or generating wealth for the state. There isn't a wealth creation aspect to that money. The wealth creation aspect really is just your petroleum revenue and all of your other revenues. That's where the wealth of the state is. That's where the people are working and where you put peonies in the ground and they pop up every year and you cut them down and you sell them and you create wealth out of that activity, right? Whatever the private sector economic activity is, it's represented in all of that revenue that isn't coming into the state. That's de minimis. So we talk about a structural problem. So I've got a picture of the state here, and I've highlighted that the center circle there that says legislative decisions. It's pure white, right? Because all of our decisions are made purely. We're very purely focused.
I like that.
So what we do have to make our pure decisions is revenue coming in. And like we said, the main sources of revenue are federal funds, permanent fund earnings, and oil taxes, and a small amount of other. And then the influence that's happening within the legislature is the government lobby. One, it's because of the revenue sources and where the money's being spent. And two, it's because we're down in Juneau. We've got government institutions, and that's all of our state government that is vying for money. That's all of the local municipalities and school districts that are vying for money. Then you've got nonprofits that have been created in the state to serve quasi-government roles of dealing with social services and that type of thing. We started funding an additional set of nonprofits in the last budget cycle, which was daycare. And then you've got for-profit businesses who advocate for state spending because their business is dependent on state dollars. So think of road maintenance and other construction activities, unions fit into this category as well, right?
So a ton of this influence is folks that are connected to, their bottom line's connected to the government.
No, to that revenue.
That revenue, yeah.
In this chart, I'm showing that the legislative decisions, if you can think of that oval being propped up by those two arrows, it's kind of balancing on those two arrows. The revenue sources and the influence are influencing and guiding what legislative decisions come out of here, right? Well, I highlighted the Juneau Empire article that was written, and you can see that was written down in 2018, and I've got that red arrow in the bottom left corner kind of out of the way, so it's hard to see. It doesn't really step out at you. It's kind of forgotten about, but that was 2018. Our private sector, small business economy is really struggling. It continues to struggle. And there's nothing in this chart that I'm showing you that influences our legislative decisions that has anything to do with that small business environment.
Yeah.
Unless it's tied to getting revenue from the state. If you've got a line item in the budget, then you've got some sort of lobby down here that's going to benefit your business. Which
to me is very concerning. I mean, if people are listening to this and connecting the dots, that's very, very worrisome if I'm a small business owner, which I am.
We've got outward migration of Alaskans, and people want to know why. And down here, they'll say, well, they're leaving because the schools suck. Well, that might be part of it, but it might also be part that we don't have a growing economy. So what's happened since the decline of oil, right? We established oil in the state. It saved the state from misery because we had lots of oil money, and it worked for many years, and it's still to some extent working, but it's in decline. The oil industry and the revenue generated from it is in decline. You have to continue to explore and drill new wells and produce more amounts of oil to see an increase in oil revenue into the future. And we're not doing that. The political environment, both nationally and internationally, is making it very difficult for oil industry to drill new wells. So for the foreseeable future, not excluding the Willow project, we're going to continue to see a decline of oil revenue. Well, this decline started decades ago. We recognized it. We did what legislatures do. We adjusted our tax scheme to make more revenue for us at the cost of oil industry, right? That's how we came up with the ACES tax scheme.
I like that you call it a scheme.
That scheme, yeah. So the point is that the Prudhoe Bay revenue structure, the revenue that's coming from that is over long term is going to continue to be in decline. So over the past decade, we spent down our savings, recognizing that oil was not going to fill the budget. We reduced some of our expenses, largely capital investments, capital spending, and some statewide items and some operating expenses. So we've done some reductions in state spending. But we spent down $16 billion down to about $2 billion as it's currently at. And if we don't do anything different, we're going to continue having to pull from that CBR with the decline of oil. If oil comes up, then we don't have to pull from the CBR. We don't have any other choice if those are the two sources of revenue. It's not, and I'll get to that in a minute. But you would have to continue to spend out of the CBR to balance your budget if your oil is not going to pay the bills.
And that's only got a couple years left.
And it's only got a couple years left at the rate at which we need to pull from.
Okay.
So now we've got the permanent fund dividend program that has, since Governor Walker was in, got tapped to help pay for state government. So when I came in 2018, we were still, fighting over a statutory PFD. And over the years, it's turned into a 5% of market value and a 50-50 draw. And now we're at a 25-75 because we don't have another source of revenue. Oil is declining. CBR balance is about gone. Our savings is about gone. And we don't have another source of revenue. And what the question's got to be, what's next? Because our government is going to continue to grow. Even if, and I'm not saying that from a political perspective, I'm saying that from a numbers perspective. We could change that, but we have programmatic increases and we have inflationary increases that will, over time, the government will just naturally grow. We have to be very disciplined to prevent that from happening. And discipline is not a word that I would use to describe our legislature.
Yeah, even if you have a group of folks down there that are committed to small government, worst case scenarios, it's still going to grow at the rate of inflation. Probably.
And I showed with the previous slide that the effort that it takes to instill discipline is directly related to the amount of lobbying that goes on down here from the government lobby to increase spending. And that's increased spending through operational budgets, meaning institutions need additional spending. And then that's lobbying for additional capital projects, for necessary capital projects. So it's a never-ending cycle and a very influential lobby that continues the growth of government. So what happens next, right? So you've got oil money, which the state has kind of been its largest source of revenue. It's not enough to pay for state government anymore. We've used our savings. It's about gone, and it's not enough to continue with the spending of the growth of government. And our PFD the permanent fund dividend is going to be gone because the growth of government is going to consume it. We don't have another source of revenue, and we don't have the will to reduce the spending. So it's only a matter of time before we just spend all of the permanent fund earnings on government. So what's next? We have a couple options. It's likely, and this is what the conversation is right now in the legislature, that we just need more oil taxes.
Yeah.
Right? Well, there's a line at which you can't cross and still have oil industry. I don't know what that line is. I don't get to decide that. The oil companies do. So all we have to do is keep ratcheting up the amount of taxes that we're drawing from the oil industry. And pretty soon they will decide, you know what? It's not as profitable as we need it to be. And we're going to go somewhere else. We'll take our capital, we'll take our people, and we'll go somewhere else and make money somewhere else doing something else. So that's a short-sighted and limited option with a dwindling revenue source. There are a lot of people here that want to have an income tax. We used to have an income tax. History says we could have it. We could raise enough revenue to help pay for our budget off of an income tax. And I hear that down here all the time. We just need another income tax. But we have an outward migration of people. If you institute an income tax, especially if you're going to institute a high earners income tax that is intellectually going to draw from the people that are wealthy and most able to pay a tax, what are they going to do?
They're going to say, bye-bye.
They're going to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm going somewhere else.
They're going to say, I'm going to go retire to Florida or something.
Right? I mean, that's a recipe for helping move people out of the state. So it's short-sighted. So we've got options. we've got budget cuts. We can just reduce our government spend, but the current legislature doesn't want to do that. So that's out of the equation. We could institute some sort of a plan that includes a series of things that would improve our position, improve this structure going into the future. If we could put a spending limit in place that slows or limits the growth of government over time, we would be in a better position in time because we've instilled discipline into the legislature and are able to keep control or keep the growth level down and predictable. But there aren't enough members in the legislature who just want to implement a functional spending limit. So you've got to tie it, you've got to make it a political arrangement or an agreement, compromise, in order to get a spending limit into place. So somebody who wants a sales tax or wants an income tax or wants oil taxes, maybe you can get them to agree to, fine, we'll say yes to an oil tax, we'll say yes to some other sort of source of revenue, but only if we can constrain our spending. Because again, I'll remind you and the listeners, we have a divided legislature. We don't have unanimous agreement on how to solve this problem. So we have to find some compromise that gets us out of this structural problem. Well, to date, we haven't been able to find agreement on some sort of comprehensive plan. But Alaskans want to see their PFD continued, even if it's smaller. I saw the State Chamber of Commerce poll that just came out, and Alaskans would like to see their government reduced. They would be okay with a smaller PFD, at least according to this poll, but they want to see the PFD program continue. This model is what I'm showing you is a recipe for an elimination of the PFD program. It will happen. It will naturally happen.
Yeah, folks that are listening, the Senate just voted 25-75. So because I know I'm going to get folks that are going to say, oh, it will never be 25-75. Well, it just got voted. Was it yesterday? 25-75.
The Senate Finance sent the budget out of Senate Finance without a PFD. They balanced the budget with spending and without a PFD.
No PFD.
On no PFD.
Wow.
That's the budget of the future. The Senate floor added in a 25-75. So they've also passed a bill, and maybe that hasn't happened yet. The budget hasn't come to us back from the Senate, so that part hasn't happened. I'm getting ahead of myself. What has come from the Senate floor and is now in the House is a bill to change the statute to a 25-75 split.
Yeah.
So that we would stop fighting over it and just have a 25-75. But again, it's not constitutional. We can just ignore it anytime we want. And it's basically a ploy to get through this legislative session. But the point is,
say it's legal.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The point is that without any sort of change, if we're not going to cut the budget to save the PFD, and we're not going to raise taxes to save the PFD, then the PFD is going to go away. That's it.
Yeah.
Those are your options. Those are the two levers you have to make. You either have to have the will to reduce spending or have to have the will to raise revenue somewhere else in order to see the permanent fund earnings come to us. Now, this is what I'm concerned about. Government wins, the people leave. We don't have
government in U-Haul.
Right? So I'm going to go back a couple slides here just to have this. So this is what's really important. We're not going to see growth in our economy until a couple things happen. One, there's got to be a reason for people to stay in Alaska or come to it. And those reasons are varied. One of them, and probably the biggest one, is economic growth. There have to be jobs and good paying jobs in Alaska for people to want to come to Alaska and stay here. There needs to be good schools. If I'm going to raise a family, we need to have good quality schools. And if I'm a business owner and I want to come capitalize on opportunity, there's got to be low cost energy. And those are three things that are musts when you're looking at families and entrepreneurs moving around. Entrepreneurs are going to need people. He's going to need employees to make his business model work. So you need good education, you need good jobs, you need low cost energy, and for the most part, we don't really talk about solutions here because none of that is really required for the government lobby. As long as we have a source of revenue and an ability to tax, we don't really care about that small other. We don't really care about all the other revenue sources and where it's coming from, because we can always go back to the investment earnings or oil taxes. There's nothing that the legislature needs to do in order to continue funding the government and the government programs from that non-oil economy that's represented on this slide. So the structural change that needs to happen is to give the government a reason to care about our non-oil economy. We don't talk about a whole lot of reductions in regulation reform, business license reform. What we do talk about is adding boards and commissions to different industries to help regulate them and make us safer and make it more complex and harder to do business. That's what we do talk about. But if we want to have a prosperous Alaska, then we have to focus on that non-oil economic engine. And it's we, the legislature, that has to focus on that. We can't grow it ourselves. We need to create conditions where others can prosper. So to the extent that a fiscal plan that addresses a sales tax, a corporate income tax reduction, a PFD solution that constitutionalizes a payment of a PFD and implements a spending cap, an effective spending cap, those are all necessary to get us on a structural path that forces the legislature to consider economic growth a priority for the state.
And your plan has all those items in it.
Correct. That's correct.
And I think a lot of folks, when I've talked to folks, one of their first questions is, well, it's the spending cap and the permanent fund, is that in this plan, is that going to be in the Constitution, or is it just a statute that folks can ignore?
Nope. So the PFD solution, my HJR House Joint Resolution 7 spells out that the permanent fund dividend program is dedicated. So we've got a prohibition against the dedication of funds in our Constitution. And what that means is, unless it's specifically identified in the Constitution, the legislature has to appropriate money every year. So House Joint Resolution 7 modifies the Constitution to enable us to dedicate the revenue from the permanent fund to two particular sources, one to the permanent fund dividend program and one to state government. In the spirit of compromise, I have agreed to a bill that is a passenger or a companion to that resolution that would eliminate the 21% of net earnings statute, even though that's what I would like. I think I like that structure better. But the majority of the legislature wants to see the percent of market value structure. So the 110, HB 110 would codify, it would put in statute that there's a 5% of market value draw, and that earnings is split 50-50 for government and for the permanent fund dividend program. And you can't ignore that statute. The legislature doesn't have to appropriate to make it happen, because the resolution changes the Constitution to a shall pay. It just happens. It's a dedicated program. The permanent fund dividend gets paid, the payment to state government gets paid, and we don't have to appropriate it in the budget process. It doesn't have to be in our budget anymore. Likewise,
what about the constitutional spending cap? Is that in your plan? Is that going to be put in the Constitution?
Representative Stapp and Senator Kaufman brought forward a spending limit package that was HJR 2, House Joint Resolution 2 on the House side, and HB 38, House Bill 38. And those two work together. One of them is a constitutional amendment that eliminates the current ineffective constitutional spending limit and brings that down and ties it to the size of our gross domestic product in the state. So it ties it to our economy. So if the economy grows, then spending can grow. So, but it's constitutional, and his limit puts a constitutional number in there of 14%. The HB 38 is a companion to that and says there's a lower limit of 11.5%, and you can bypass that 11.5% only for capital spending. So your operating budget is limited to 11.5%, basically. And then your capital spend can be between the 11% and the 14%. And it requires a higher threshold vote to override that spending limit.
So can these two things, is this something that is going to be on the ballot, or is this something that you guys can implement? What's the thought process there?
Great question. Both of the resolutions require the people to vote on them because they're modifying the Constitution.
Okay.
People would have to say yes to a spending limit, and they would have to say yes to constitutionalizing the PFD. And the other bills, the companion pieces of legislation, are tied to the passage of those bills. So they wouldn't take effect unless the resolutions are passed. That can be written into the piece of legislation so that we pass the legislation, and then, next year when we vote, they won't take effect if the people vote the plan down. Same thing with the sales tax. The sales tax could be written so that if people say no to a spending limit and no to a permanent fund dividend, constitutionally protected permanent fund dividend, then the sales tax wouldn't come into effect.
And is the sales tax, I think that's, I think conservatives are going to be super excited about the constitutional spending cap, super excited about getting the permanent fund in the Constitution, and the sales tax, they're going to go, is that a carrot out there so that you can get all teams to work with you on this? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Fiscal Policy Working Group document, the report, indicated that you've got a constitutional protection of the PFD, you've got an effective spending limit that's required, you've got some budget reductions that need to happen, and you've got some broad-based revenue that needs to be raised. And that is the political arrangement that has to be in place in order to get the votes for any one of these components to pass in the legislature. Because there aren't enough votes for people to just pass a constitutional amendment protecting the PFD. Mm-hmm. We can't do that all by itself. Likewise, we can't pass just a resolution for a spending limit that's effective. And if you're going to change the spending limit and you're just going to do it in statute, then and think that it's going to be effective, then you just don't understand fundamentally how the state of Alaska budget process works. We, through the appropriations process, can ignore any statute that we need to pass a budget. That's our authority based on the Constitution. I don't agree with that, but that's the way it is.
That's the reality. That's why you can, essentially, meet longer than 90 days. That's one of the biggest questions is, well, they don't pay attention to it. Well, realistically, you all can pretty much do whatever you want.
If we repealed the dedication of funds clause out of the Constitution, then we establish a statute that says the legislature shall pay X. Then we can't violate that.
Yeah.
Because we've dedicated that fund, and the Constitution says, hey, if it's dedicated, then it's the effect of the Constitution that says you must do this. If you want to change it, then change the law or change the Constitution, but not through a budget bill. And so that's what we're trying to get to with regards to the spending limit and the PFD program. So yeah, so I guess the answer to your question is yes, it is kind of the carrot, but if you look over at the revenue forecast that I'm sharing, the legislature only cares, and it will only ever care, about the revenue sources that are coming into the state. That is our purpose. It's our constitutional requirement to come and pass a budget. If Alaskans, and I know this is hard to hear, if Alaskans continue to look to oil and permanent fund earnings to pay for its state government without it taxing Alaskans, then those who are actually paying the taxes are going to bend the ear of the legislature. They're the ones that have the most lobby influence down in Juneau. It's just a fact of nature that if you pay for something, you have a dog in the fight and people care about what you think. But if you're not paying for it, then Juneau is a long ways away. So it's a paradigm shift for Alaskans.
So your plan puts a constitutional spending cap, puts the permanent fund in the Constitution. Both of those things would be on the ballot. And if both of those pass, then it would kind of set into gear a sales tax, 1%, 2%, 3%, something like that. And what you're saying to the folks that are listening is those first two things will never make it out of the House or the Senate to even be on the ballot unless there's a sales tax.
Unless there's, and I would say it doesn't have to be a sales tax, unless there's some sort of broad-based revenue increase. So we could end up with an income tax. And I'll tell you, if the current crop of Republicans were not in the majority, we'd probably have an income tax. And I would guess that that's what the left would put in place eventually. You know, once we spend the entire permanent fund dividend program on state government here in a few years, the government is still going to grow. The government doesn't have anywhere else to go. They've already used all of the permanent fund earnings for themselves. The oil, they can't squeeze any more oil out. They will come to,
or else the oil companies are going to say bye-bye.
they will come to Alaskans with some other tax. So the question that we really have before us is, do you want a PFD? Do you value the PFD program? Do you want to continue a PFD and have a tax? Or do you want to have a tax and no dividend? Because that's where it's headed.
So what do you say to the folks that say, well, you know, and I'm in this boat, you and I have had this conversation, just cut your way out of it, you know, figure it out, cut it. I don't understand why you're doing more of this mumbo jumbo, political stuff. Just go in there and start slicing and dicing.
Yeah. So that's technically possible, but it means that the way we do government would be drastically changed. And that causes pain and discomfort within the government lobby, and therefore pain and discomfort down here in Juneau. We don't have the legislators elected that are willing to endure that kind of discomfort in order to reduce the spending on the state budget. You would literally have to be addressing the two largest budgets that we have, education and health, Medicaid. You would have to make some sort of drastic changes to the way we do it. Talking, your deficit this year is between $800 and $900 million. So you're going to take $400, $500, $600, $700 million out of either of those two budgets. It's a drastic restructuring of what those two organizations would do. If you cut it out of education, then your local school districts and local boroughs are going to have a shift of some kind in spending or in services provided. So if that's what Alaskans want, then we can do that. It is technically possible to just line item, and the governor could do it too. Just line item it out. We won't spend on that, and those programs would atrophy or not get funded, and they would die and go away, and we would have a new normal without those programs. We'd figure out a way to do it. But you don't have the legislature to be able to do that. You don't have the people down here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks unfortunately, God bless him, the governor had a good run at it, and we all conservative saw what that was like, he, you might as well thought he was killing a bunch of kittens in his basement. That's how they treated him. And I think that scares a lot of folks from elected folks from making those cuts, because they're like, holy crap, remember what happened to Governor Dunleavy when he tried to make cuts? The sky was falling.
You're making a point that I was going to bring up. From a human nature perspective, those who were in the legislature for Dunleavy's first term are a little gun shy.
Yeah.
Because those in the legislature who did support the reductions, some of them got hammered for doing so by constituencies and by the government lobby. And there wasn't a whole lot of vocal support for those individuals. And they're just gun shy.
Yeah.
Right or wrong, my intuition and my political philosophy says I don't have to worry about the criticism. I'm here to do a job.
Yeah.
But I'm not all people, and people don't think like I do. So the very human reality is that some people are going to shy away and are shying away from criticism about making hard decisions to cut the budget. It isn't right or wrong. It just is. That is just the reality we have here. I'm not passing judgment on anybody. I'm just saying that's
just what it is.
This is what it is.
So in your opinion, you're one of the more senior House people there now. You've been around for budget cycles. If something like this fiscal plan does not get put in place this year or next year, sayonara to the permanent fund.
Yes. So you said permanent fund, not permanent fund dividend.
Yeah.
So here's a sticky problem. So we go and spend the permanent fund dividend program completely on state government, so that all of our permanent fund earnings are going to pay for state services. Okay. And that's a new paradigm. If you come in and tax people, whether it's a sales tax or an income tax, and you set a rate that sustains government because the government growth is greater than what the permanent fund earnings can support, and you need additional revenue, and you don't have economic growth within the state, then you continue the decline of the economy and continue the decline of the people leaving the state. And that presents a problem, because if we can't sustain our budget, and we don't want to cut our budget, then at some point in time we run out of money. We don't have money. You could cut the budget then, but you might have a situation where your pension funds become insolvent because we can't afford them. What happens if we have too many bad stock market years in a row? What if the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency for the world, and we see a massive amount of inflation come in? Like, my crystal ball is as cloudy as the next guy, but the future doesn't look bright for Americans right now. We don't have good fiscal policies and good policies that we can bank on with hope right now. And so if our pension funds become insolvent, and we owe billions of dollars to them right now, the courts are going to say, they're not going to recognize that there's a constitutional prohibition against spending out of the permanent fund, not the dividend program, the corpus of the fund.
Oh yeah, they're going to say, take $10 billion from that fund, hop it over to this pension fund, and call it good.
That's exactly it. Because there is a constitutional guarantee that those pensions will not be diminished in the future. So the state is going to pay that $9 billion. It's either going to come from our budget and from our taxes, or from the permanent fund earnings, or it's going to come from the permanent fund itself eventually.
Yeah. So you have this fiscal plan. Is this something that is going to be I know it's being looked at this year, but do you think this is going to come to a fruition and actually be voted on this year? Is this like a next year thing?
So I'm suspecting that there's going to be a special session called. I don't know whether it's going to be immediate or whether it's going to be later in the year. but I suspect that the governor is going to call a special session to deal with this. I don't know whether there's an appetite. Right now, I would say there's not really an appetite in the Senate to do anything with the fiscal plan. Again, there are many members of the Senate who would rather just spend the entire permanent fund earnings on state government and be done with the permanent fund dividend program.
Hence their budget with no permanent fund dividend in it.
That's it. That telegraphed all I needed to know. So we're either going to deal with it in a special session. The writing's on the wall that we're not going to be able to do anything about it this session. Well, I'll either do it in a special session or we'll take it up again next session. It's not impossible to do next January. It is difficult because it's an election year. But I don't know what better of something to be going forward with after the session that you've solved this political problem, this structural problem, and then go to the voters with it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there is some advantage to look at this, to be able to say, hey, we finally did what many legislatures could not do. I mean, ever since the start of the decline of oil, the legislature has recognized that we need to do something.
The can's been kicked down the road, and it's only probably got another 20 feet to be kicked down before it implodes.
And there's some philosophy here in the state and also in the legislature that says, hey, the only way you're ever going to get to change that matters, that's needed, is to run the train off the tracks, to spend all the money, just be done, be broke, and then it forces everybody to have to make decisions. There's truth to that. That is a way. I think the prudent, the wise person says, hey, if I've got resources that can prevent me from running the train off the tracks, then I ought to use those resources to prevent that from happening, because it's much worse to run the train off the tracks than to find a solution before you run out of track.
Well, I think this has been very helpful, Representative Carpenter. I do really appreciate you thinking about what does it look like for Alaska to have a long-term fiscal plan. I think you've got great staff there helping you. For folks that need to be reminded, he has Donna Arduin helping on, I think, is she on one of the committees as a staff person?
Yeah, she's my policy advisor for House Ways and Means.
Nice. And she is just phenomenal, folks. I mean, our crowd knows her, but man, she is one of the leading budget experts in the whole United States when it comes to state budgets. And we're blessed to have her here in the state again, working with Ben. And Ben, do you have any last minute thoughts here before we head off?
Yeah, I would and I think Donna would want me to put a plug in for other states that have ratcheted back their income taxes and are relying on a sales tax structure, that those states are booming. That when you remove taxes from the function of actually going to work and change the structure of taxes to that which is spending, then you have a better stable growth curve for state governments and for the economy of the state. And I just have to remind people that if you're thinking about what you really, really want, is it a large PFD or is it a growing economy? If we're telegraphing in our conversations to our legislators that what we really want is a growing economy, then we need to have those conversations. What do we put in place to grow our economy? A permanent fund dividend that is consumed by the government does not benefit our private sector economy. A permanent fund dividend that gets spent in our private sector economy benefits our private sector economy. And if you put a tax in place that then helps fund the government, then some of that permanent fund comes back to the state government through a sales tax, but it's benefiting our private sector growth. That is a much preferable situation to be in than no permanent fund dividend and a tax, because that's where we're headed.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Representative Carpenter. We'll put a link to your bills here in the podcast description so folks can go check them out. And we wish you success down there in Juneau, and I'm sure I'll see you when you get back here in town in Nikiski. We hope everybody has an amazing rest of their day here in Alaska and wherever you're listening to all around the globe. And until next time, I'm John Quick from somewhere in Alaska. Thanks, Representative Carpenter.
Thanks, Don. It was good. Thanks for
Yep.
the conversation.